exchange that you're here part of now. This is our roundtable titled Engaging Bureaucracy. I will allow the panelists to introduce themselves, but please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Cool. Okay. Cool. So, we don't. No media, except for we have some future media. So before we do the introductions, I think I'm just going to talk a bit about the structure of the panel, at least insofar as we sort of agreed on. So we're going to start off with personal introductions where we talk about like just ourselves and our academic background, and then we're going to segue into like descriptions of our projects, and then we're going to go into like each of us is essentially going to lead a discussion based on what I would say is a concept which we think like allows us to talk about all of our very disparate projects in a way that feels somehow intersectional. So I think we should just start with DAP and then. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then we might also need a couple minutes to like set up one because DAP is gonna perform a song for us.
So my name is Dolapo. I'm very sorry I was late this morning, afternoon. I'm a senior, I'm studying classics and music. My project is called And Then There Was One, and it's a musical album based on my life story, pretty much. But the main focus is to do with pursuing your dreams versus having to sustain a living, make a living rather. And so that for me, that dichotomy was either pursuing music or going to law school. I had a show last night, which was my last show as an undergraduate, hence I've lost my voice. I apologize also why I'm late. But my project outlines my whole Brown career, which was spent trying to balance pursuing music whilst keeping my academics up. And I'm also Nigerian, and there's a strong sense of education in our culture. As I'm sure you guys know the stereotype where African parents expect you to either be an engineer, a lawyer, a doctor, or that's your options pretty much. So that's a brief introduction to my project, and I'm sure I can elaborate more later.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm studying public health. My project was called Sexual Health Behavior and Knowledge Among LGBTQ Brown Undergraduates, and it was a mixed methods analysis. I came into Brown studying public health, and I started out primarily doing HIV research, and from there kind of expanded a bit on my interests, and now my interests lie more in looking at sexual minority populations and sexual health among those populations, and kind of looking at the lack of acknowledgement of intersectional identities in like public health research and interventions that are designed for these populations. So that's kind of what spurred my project. So I had LGBTQ Brown undergrads complete an online survey in the fall, and I got about 160 responses from that. And then I also did 20 interviews in, I think, February of this year. And so the survey was a lot about people's sexual health behaviors, and also utilization of healthcare and STI and HIV testing services, both at Brown and also outside of Brown. And then the interviews were focused much more on interactions with healthcare providers and utilization of resources at Brown and potential enhancements that could be made in the future to improve resources and support available for LGBTQ undergrads.
My name is Mo. I am also a public health concentrator and also a Nigerian. So I am from Southern Illinois, very, very small town, one of two Black families, and we were both mixed families. And I came to Brown to be a doctor. Nigerian parents. But I found public health, and I find that my interest in health is much more from a population-based and preventative outlook on health and health education. My project that I'll be presenting on today is my senior honors thesis, which was an exploratory study of smoking cessation in homeless populations. And I looked specifically at the Rhode Island homeless. I've worked in multiple homeless shelters over my time at Brown, all around Rhode Island, and I've worked with a lot of substance misuse and recovery. So I kind of combined all of that extracurricular volunteer work into a thesis where I also did a mixed method study. I did quantitative individual interviews and qualitative focus groups with a bunch of homeless adults who are current smokers and gathered information on their perceived needs and perceived barriers to quitting smoking. So I'll go into a lot of the barriers that exist that inhibit currently homeless adults from quitting smoking, and also just making other steps economically and socially in their lives.
I'm Yousef. I transferred to Brown last year as a junior. I'm concentrating in English, but sort of did a lot of stuff with like comp lit and history. And then the project is Katie and I's project. We started the Underground Coffee Shop, which is just down that way. And we're going to be talking about kind of like our narrative, challenging kind of Brown's bureaucracy in the administration to allow us to kind of run a space that's very unconventional in terms of our model, both our economic model, but also kind of just like how we run things. And then hopefully I can integrate some, we're trying to like be as intersectional as possible without like straining the relationship between our projects, because like I mentioned before, they're very disparate, and it's gonna be, like I wouldn't wanna over theorize the connections between like public health stuff and like the underground and the coffee shop, but hopefully we can have like, because we have concepts that are like broad enough to allow for like, hopefully like a lot of different ways to handle those questions. Yeah.
So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Katie. I'm also a senior. Yousef and I transferred at the same time. We both transferred as juniors, which was a lot of the impetus for starting the underground. We were very aware coming in about what our expectations for Brown were and the sort of like gap between our expectations and the reality of sort of like community space at Brown.
Yeah.
And a lot of our impetus for it was a place where community could be built, a space that felt like students had stakes in it, in that it was provided for students by students, and just sort of seeing like what would arise if we created a space like that for the Brown community.
Yeah, okay, cool. So just some quick other thing on the structure. So I think the 4 concepts that we're using basically to like, to thread our conversation on bureaucracy are education, which DAP's going to be leading, and then we're going to move into a conversation about like what comes after education, kind of like the ways of dealing with bureaucracy through habits, broadly put, and then we're going to talk about what comes after this, like our projects and whatnot, and then each of those sections is going to be 10 minutes, and then we're going to go into Q&A. So, cool. Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
We can share this one.
Hello. Let's see. So I'm going to start talking about education. So I'm going to try and break it down into 3 parts, 3 themes, which one will be cross-generational education, the second will be academic education, and third will be sort of real-life education, so to speak. So the first thing, so when I graduated high school, I went to high school in London, in the UK, and when I graduated high school, I asked my parents if I could go to Berklee College of Music, which I did for a year before I came to Brown. And it was always meant to be a gap year plan. So leaving Berklee College of Music, coming to Brown, I made a mixtape called Goodbye for Now, which was my way of saying goodbye to music, so to speak, because I didn't think I'd be able to pursue it as fully at Brown University. But my parents always stressed the importance of getting an education before you follow your dreams. They did the same thing with my older sister. She had to go get a business degree from Imperial College in London before she was allowed to go to Berklee and pursue music, and now she's pursuing music outright. So I had my first ever show my freshman year, March 14th, and that's when I really started to take my music very seriously. And it wasn't until about my junior year when I put out a project called Goodbye for Never, which flipped the script on my previous project, Goodbye for Now, when I realized that music was a part of me and it was a part of my whole journey. It wasn't separate from school, and it wasn't like a plan B, or music wasn't my plan A and going to law school was my plan B. It was all part of the same story. And that self-education also made me realize that my grandparents, who are about 80-something, and a little background about my grandpa, he got into Oxford University when he was about my age. I only found this out the day I found out I got into Columbia Law School, actually. But he had to give up going to university to support his whole family. And so his younger brother got a scholarship and got sent off to Oxford, and he gave that up. So it's his dream for one of his kids or his grandkids to go to Harvard Law School. And that's where that pressure comes from, and that's where it stems from. And so in conjunction with that, conversations with my mother about why he put so much pressure on me, and I know how intelligent a man he is, I couldn't understand why he couldn't see that I had a bigger dream, and I felt like you're my parent or grandparent, you worked this hard so I could follow my dreams and not have to do what I have to do to make money in this capital world we live in. But my mom explained to me that the generation gap might be too big for it to be even worth explaining to him what it is to be a rapper, singer, producer. So that's the first part of educating that I had to understand. It was self-educating myself. That doesn't make sense. Ignore anything I say that doesn't make sense, please. But educating myself on the power of what I do, because no one else will really know how powerful my music is unless I can understand that myself and articulate it to them. My parents or grandparents will never understand why my music might be powerful in this generation or in this culture that I'm in. And in conjunction with that, understanding that sometimes it might be impossible to explain to other people why you're doing what you do, and that's the growing up moment where you have to make the decision to leap and follow your dreams. The second kind of education is academic education. Since I was a kid, I've always been a nerd. I'm sure most brown kids can agree. We're all pretty nerdy kids. We may have a little too much fun at times, but when all is said and done, we're all very, very, we all aspire for greatness. So my academic education has always come first. And so last year, I entered this competition held by Converse called Rubber Tracks. And I applied, and I was one of the people chosen to record at Abbey Road Studios in London with Mark Ronson as my mentor. And of course, the way my life is, as per usual, a week later when I got back, I was flown to London Friday and Saturday, September 25th and 26th, I'll never forget it. And I was taking the LSAT on October 3rd. Cue parents. So I asked my dad if I could go, and he initially said, no, I don't think it's a good idea. And I'm obviously on the other side of the phone like, you must be crazy. Because how am I supposed to give up going to Abbey Road Studios where the Beatles have recorded because I have an exam the week later? So again, it came down to my hard work and my discipline, and I convinced him that, you know how hard I work, if you let me go, I promise I'll be fine. And he was like, if I let you go, you cannot mess up the LSAT. So Oludolapo flies off to London, has an amazing time in the studio, comes back with all kinds of things in my head, thinking I just met Mark Ronson, I just made 3 songs with him, I was just in Abbey Road Studios, fly back to school jet-lagged, and fall ill that week. And mind you, on the flight there, I took a practice LSAT test. I had 2 nights in the studio. The night I got home for the first day, I took a practice test. The flight back, took a practice test. The whole week, I was really ill. Took practice tests until about the Thursday I started feeling better. Took the LSAT on the Saturday and got a decent score. Score I wasn't happy with, but decent enough, just about. But the importance of that for me, which my parents have always told me, is understanding that taking the LSAT wasn't something that was taking away from my music. In the long run, musicians have sometimes a lifespan of 6 months, sometimes, rest in peace to Prince, a lifespan of about 30 years. But you can't guarantee that either way. So having a contingency plan when you finish being the guy in the industry, you need a way to sustain yourself and make money and make a living. And to me, that was the importance of making sure I didn't mess up the LSAT, even though I had this big opportunity in London. So education has always been important for me. And a friend of mine called Austin Martin, who's currently a junior at Brown, recently went to speak in LA. How much time do I have? Can someone let me know how much time I have so I don't go too long?
I'm asking questions too. So
okay. he recently went to LA, and he's in the same situation. His parents want him to get a master's, but he started this application/education tool called Rhymes with Reason, which uses lyrics from hip-hop songs and all kinds of songs to educate kids in inner cities in particular is what he's looking for, to help them with SAT prep and stuff like that. And it's gonna go further up in age and further down to kindergarten, and he's gonna expand on it. But when he was there, he met Big Sean, who's a famous rapper, and his mother. And he had a long conversation with them, and the main takeaway he got was that the thing they were most impressed about was the fact that he went to Brown University. Above anything else that he was doing, just the fact that he went to Brown, they couldn't believe that. And they explained to him how all these artists in the industry are the slaves of the industry, and the people who really have the power are the ones who went to these Ivy League schools, and who these 3 people at the top who own the whole industry, that's who you really want to be. And that changed my perspective from, I'm gonna take a year off, and I deferred from Columbia Law School to pursue music, and my plan was to blow up, the parents don't know that, and never go to law school. And having that conversation with him completely changed my mind, and I instantly felt like a year from now, when I'll be making a decision whether to actually go to law school, depending where I get with my music, I actually probably really should go to law school. My parents, as they usually are, were right all along. That's the second thing. And the third thing, I already forgot, was academic.
Well, I was going to ask a question about kind of growing up in London. Sort of how did you balance, because I know you learned music formally.
Yeah.
So kind of rap music right now is in like a super do-it-yourself culture right now, like kind of just download software. So how did you kind of like, to what extent did you learn how to rap kind of through other means? Because I know rap music is just kind of
it's not really formalized.
So kind of how do you?
The way I started rapping was I was always a musical kid. My friends, I played the piano since I was 4 years old, so I was always a musician. As soon as we hit 14, that turbulent age, all my friends decided they want to be rappers, and I was like, this is great. I don't like being number one. I love being number two. I love being behind the scenes and doing all the work and not getting a lot of the credit. So I was like, I'll be the producer. That's perfect. And as I started producing, I realized how much I loved hip-hop music. And when I turned 17, people were taking too long to use my music. So I just listened to so much music and educated myself. That's the only way you could really do it. And started writing. And I knew, because I've been playing the piano since I was 4 years old, that if you put in 10,000 hours of work, eventually you will get there and you'll get better. So I just never stopped writing until I stopped giving people beats at all and stopped writing with anyone. So it was really just self-teaching.
I know that like recently I found out that Berkeley like accepted their first like rap artist sort of. Did you have any interest in doing rap music at Berkeley, or was it more just classical stuff?
So I went in my primary instrument was piano, so I went in as a classical pianist, but it's primarily a jazz school, so I started learning jazz, piano, and improvisation and stuff like that. But my concentration would have been music production and engineering. So there wasn't really, some of the other concentrations are contemporary writing and production, there's composition, there's performance, there's no real rap category or anything to do with lyricism. So, and in that vein also, something I also should mention is that everything really does happen for a reason. I applied to Oxford University before I came to Brown. I got I applied twice, just because my parents made me do it twice. Got an interview both times, didn't get in both times, and that's the best thing that ever happened to me. And in the same vein, leaving Berkeley actually helped in coming to Brown, because I've been able to cultivate my music as a rapper, because Berkeley doesn't really have a formalized program for rap anyways. Better here, because I'm interacting with so many different kids from so many different backgrounds and so many different interests, that I'm always getting inspired by different things, and that helps me write more, as opposed to being in a music school where it's based around practice, 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 and everyone is sort of out there for themselves, trying to make it happen for themselves.
And then my last question for that was, so right now, like, I know Harvard recently like created that kind of with Nas, they like kind of have a school for, so basically like kind of, could you talk a little about like the intersection between kind of, I guess like rap education and literature, in terms of kind of like there being a culture now that's taking like lyrics very seriously, but also like Kendrick Lamar being someone who like kind of conceives of himself as a preacher or someone who could like educate the masses. So kind of
I think probably the best way to, oh, real life, oh, that's perfect. Okay, so, let me just think about this for a second. Yeah, I think the best way to attack that is, if we look at poets, just take poetry. notoriously we all respect, or just writers, we all respect a Shakespeare. I'm a classic student and respect Homer, people whose words have lasted 2,000 years, which is crazy. Those are the people I consider my competition in my head. That's the level I want to be respected on. Same with, rather than someone who's been producing for 5 years, my competition is Beethoven. That's how I like to think of it. So with that said, for whatever reason, your Tupacs, your Biggies, your Kendrick Lamars, your Jay-Z's, for some reason will never be respected in the same light as someone like a Shakespeare for their writing. And that's, so can you repeat your question again? Let me just get back on track.
Well, I guess I would sort of disagree. I think that there's a culture now, at least that's emerging, which is beginning to take rap lyrics very seriously. But I was going to ask kind of like, how do you conceive educating masses or education period through your own music, and kind of how, like, the relationship with the
Personally, I think the biggest thing about being an artist is the truth, and telling the truth at all times. I think that's what the biggest education is. That's how I educate people. I don't have all the information on politics, but I speak a lot about politics, and I have all the information about racism or corruption or love. Just any theme that I speak of in my music is all personal experiences, just sharing what I've been through or friends have been through, and anything that I feel like I have the right to articulate. To me, that's the education that's most important, and that comes back to the real life education, being streetwise as opposed to book smart. I was always told I was book smart growing up, and I had no common sense, which to an extent was true. But coming to Brown especially really made me just come out of my shell completely and be myself. I knew what I didn't know, I knew what I knew. I knew how to find the information that I wanted to find. And so my education, my music really is just the truth. And as you've seen, I've just told you about my life. I haven't really spoken to you in an academic sense. I've really just told you what I've been through, and that's how I educated myself when I came to Brown, is listening to people and engaging with people. But to bring it back to the poetry thing, things like I mentioned my friend Austin Martin are doing, trying to educate kids through rap lyrics, things that they actually engage with. I think that's excuse me. I think that's where the world is starting to move, because not only rap music, but in particular rap music and hip hop music is becoming pop culture right now.
Yeah.
So I'm sure all of you know a song that goes, wah, 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 wah. If I sang you 10 songs, I'm sure you'd recognize all the hip hop ones as well as all the other ones. You might not even recognize the ones that aren't hip hop songs, but that's the level that hip hop has got to, and rap music. So I think the whole world seems to be changing right now. The music industry is changing right now, and everything seems, all the archaic systems seem to be being broken down. And to me, that's where the power of education comes in with music. And not just in making a musical album and speaking about your life and about important topics like politics, like race, etc., but also immediately in a classroom setting. There is a space for education through music, especially through real lyricism, like rap music or hip hop music. Yeah. Any more
I think you should
questions?
perform
Now at the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
So. Cool.
I'll get that set up.
So I'm going to talk about like bureaucracy now and try to like tie a narrative that Katie and I have told many times before in different contexts, but we'll kind of go through, and then I actually have a lot of questions specifically for like our panelists about the relationship between questions of bureaucracy that we're going to talk about, and then kind of like, so like how do you expect you're going to release your music in like, you know, the kind of thing. So I guess we'll just go from the beginning, and then we were talking earlier about all these thoughts we had on bureaucracy, but do you want to go start with like
Sure.
okay, cool.
So Yousef and I arrived at Brown in the fall of 2014, and upon arriving, as I mentioned before, we realized that we had all these very specific expectations of Brown. And some of those expectations were a reality we found, and some of them were missing. And I think there was also a strong pressure just individually thinking I'm coming into a new place. I only have 2 years here. Sort of what sort of mark am I going to make? Am I going to be able to improve this by my presence in some way? And so one of the things that I kept thinking about was how there was a coffee shop at the place that I used to go to school at Hamilton College, which was a small liberal arts school. It was very isolated. There wasn't really a town anywhere near. The only place that I felt kind of like a real place was this student-run coffee shop that was sort of in the heart of campus. And there was sort of a student center that was in a separate building, and people didn't really hang out there. Everyone hung out at this coffee shop. And it sort of felt like a place where people could come together and exchange ideas, and things could flow in a way that didn't necessarily feel prescribed by any kind of like an administrative structure or a structure that sort of felt like it came like from the top down. It very much felt like a bottom-up space. And I was thinking about how nice it would be to have a place like that at Brown. And in the summertime, sort of like out on the main green kind of felt like that, sort of like people could move about as they wished and be creative in the way that they were like moving and engaging with people they didn't necessarily know. And I really wanted to see if we could create a place that was indoors during the winter that could happen.
So then, the panel, we're really talking about theories in action. So this really just started off as an idea that we weren't really sure about. We were at the Ratty one day and we were like drinking the coffee and we're kind of like, this coffee is kind of shitty. Like we should have a space on campus where we could get good coffee that was cheap, that we didn't have to like go out off campus to get or whatever. And then kind of on her own accord, Katie went and like just scheduled a meeting with President Paxson at our office hours, which was kind of surprising, but which kind of brings us to the first point about engaging with bureaucracy, which is that kind of start from the like most powerful person possible. So instead of starting from the bottom up, we just literally went to Paxson and we sat with her. And Katie and I both had a pitch basically about this. We knew that we wanted to use the underground, but we had this pitch for like a not-for-profit student-run space. And she was, I would say, pretty enthusiastic about it, but still kind of was like, it's gonna be a challenge, kind of like warning us about the obstacles that we would face. So then, after that, we really kind of came into contact with a slew of Brown administrative executive heads, whatever, just like from dining services, basically representatives of the Brown bureaucracy and people who really didn't, or who had a vested interest maybe in like not seeing our project succeed, I would say. So in those conversations, we were constantly like being told about kind of like all the like regulations and the accountability and the licensing that would be involved with such a project. But we kept on going with it, and eventually made a few partnerships with different groups on campus that allowed us, I think, to really sink into this space. So those, the people we kind of like made partnerships with are the Brown RISD Coffee Society, which was, it started last year. It's kind of been absorbed into the underground, but it was like a coffee education group headed by this guy named Sean Tsutsui, who works at the underground. And after teaming up with them and kind of like essentially taking their talent in a way, we started to seriously consider like who would be getting our beans from, like the sourcing practices, and also kind of like the way that we would, like how we would translate our idea, which was like arguably an idealistic thing that we wanted to do, into like a very concrete space, given the conditions and the parameters that all the administrators were telling us were kind of in our immediate future. So that being said, I think we can fast forward to like the underground now, which is like way different than we ever conceived it would be, but it's also like equally, like I'm super happy about that. And kind of, if you maybe like, I guess like how did we translate the idea, or kind of like the specific things that we wanted to do that weren't, for various reasons, weren't possible, and kind of like how, despite that, we still managed to create a model which we think is unique and like efficient. So maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big differences is just the difference between an idea and a reality. And what we have now is a reality played out with individuals who are real individuals within this community and have come in and brought their talents and their ideas and the realities of how long it takes to get a dishwasher installed and the realities of what it takes to get a license. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned along the way, and the whole process has been us, constantly revising our initial idea because we really didn't know how it was going to go. And so, in order to go into something like this and really feel like it has a chance of succeeding, I think you have to be very humble and you have to know that your vision is going to change based on what the realities are. So, like one of the things that I think really helped us as soon as we figured out was delegating. And so like getting the Brown Resi Coffee Society involved was a really good example of that. We found people who had the passion and the expertise and really didn't know anything about us and we didn't know anything about them. And we said, let's get together. We want to start a coffee shop. That sounds like something you guys might be interested in too. And you guys know all about this. We're gonna just sort of let you do your thing, and we're gonna trust you to do it well, and we're gonna give you a little bit of like freedom to work with that. And they came up with a really good system, and under the leadership of Kenta and Sean, we did all these things that Yousef and I probably wouldn't have been able to do. We figured out, what's the right temperature for brewing the beans? Like what is the weight ratio of beans to water? How long does it need to brew for? We programmed the brewer based on all those things, and we had a whole day where Kenta and Sean just went through and tried different things and experimented, and then we finally came up with just like a brewing process for us. And one of the things that's happened because of that is we have really, really good coffee. And so that's one example of that. Another example is this year we have a lot of new volunteers who are very, very dedicated, a lot of underclassmen who are coming in with their own expertise in various things, and they have ideas, and we say, yeah, go for it, try that out. Try out creating a once every other week B-side coffee house where we have performers come every Saturday. And it's takes a lot of weight off of our backs, because if Yousef and I were going to try to micromanage everything, there's no way that we would get all the things done that we've gotten done.
Yeah, and I think like a couple of things that we learned in the process are like one, like the importance of inertia, like for any organization or any group of people, just to kind of like, if you continue feeding that group of people with energy and with ideas, like it's going to continue to be dynamic and to like push for what it's going for. And I think the second thing was like kind of just like, at the end of the day, we're sort of coming from a practical position of having to just compromise. And I think like that, the question I was going to ask Dap was kind of like, okay, like for example, I have parents also who immigrated to America who like had a lot of expectations for just my like education career, and like kind of you could say maybe they're pre-professional. And kind of like how was I able to compromise my vision of like what I wanted to do with some kind of like, and to like simultaneously be able to go through with a lot of like the things they expected for me. So I guess like branching out, just like how do you expect to? I know you said you have like the 1 year, but how do you expect necessarily to like balance certain musical interests that you might have with the kind of like, I'm signed to a record label and I need to like have a pop song, or do you think you're going to do it like do it yourself, SoundCloud kind of thing?
That's a very good question. I actually don't know. My manager discovered Chance the Rapper and Vic Menson, used to manage both of them, and they're two rappers who are about 20 and 21 years old, but are getting very big right now. And interestingly, one of them just had a son, and is completely independent and gives his music all away for free. And the other is signed to Jay-Z, to Rock Nation. So those are two completely different models in the same vein. And I always ask my manager, why did Vic sign to Jay-Z? Why was that a good idea? Especially now when all these big record labels are breaking down, everything is moving from album sales to streaming. Why would it make sense? Why do you still need the machine? Why can't he do it the way Chance did it? And he gives me all these various reasons, but I actually don't know what I'm gonna do yet. I'm completely split down the middle, because I'm not sure that I want the pressure of a label, but I also understand how powerful that machine is. That opens so many doors into promoting your music and marketing, and then also sponsorship opportunities, and also getting your songs in movies. There's so many more doors that open because of that machine. But how worth it is it? That again, the compromise for the bureaucracy, so to speak.
It's really about learning how to become a businessman at the same time, because you're just like handling all your distribution, you're handling like all the like stuff that happens behind the music, which is like essential to promoting it and to like putting it up. So, not for sure. Okay, so I think we're gonna segue into.
Yeah, I actually had a few questions for both of you. So a theme that I see in both of your stories so far is learning how to balance kind of your academics with other passions, things you want to pursue.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like with DAP, you're flying back and forth, and you're flying to the UK to do this recording session, but you're taking all these practice tests. And so my theme I want to talk about today is habits, because that was a lot of what my project was on. So I want to ask you, how do you formulate these habits? One, studying all the time, being consistent, creating these study habits, taking all these practice exams. And is that the same or different as the habit of writing every day or practicing your piano every day? Where is the difference for you, if there is any?
For me, there isn't a difference, and really all comes down to one thing, which is 10,000 hours. My dad gave me this book to read called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell about 6 years ago. And chapter 2 in this book speaks to the amount of hard work it takes to become a master of something, and that number is quantified, give or take, to 10,000 hours. And without knowing it, as I said, I played the piano since I was 4 years old, so all those habits were built in from the jump. Without knowing it, I was already teaching myself the value of long-term hard work. Because I'm turning 23 in May, and I've already been doing something for almost 2 decades. So I apply that to practicing the piano, to writing my music, and to my academic work. So for me, if I was going to go to London, I was going to be doing just as much to get into law school as I was going to be doing music. And it all came down to really hard work and discipline. That's where I developed my habits from.
So something I found while I was interviewing a lot of smokers who were currently homeless was the distinction or similarities between the word habit and the word addiction. And so I guess my next question for you, Dap, is writing every day a habit that you have formed, or is it an addiction that you have to fulfill for your passion?
There's definitely both, and I actually use that exact word a lot, addiction or obsession. Because I love music that much that I couldn't, and that's why I made Goodbye for Never after Goodbye for Now. So there was no way I couldn't do music. So that obviously makes sense, but on the academic side, I don't know that I'm addicted to translating Latin and Greek every day. But I think what it is, the addiction in that sense, is the fulfillment of hard work and the reward that comes from that hard work. I think that's what I'm addicted to, and that's where the habit is formed. From the age of 4, seeing practice over and over again, 6 a.m. in the morning, practicing scales, turn into me being able to play these pieces properly. That whole cycle became an addiction of hard work really does pay off.
So I guess this is a question for all of you. Any of you can answer. Is there a line that can be drawn between the words habit and addiction? Because to me, when I hear the word addiction, there's a negative connotation. But in a lot of ways, you can be addicted to coffee, and that could be something that you may feel a little ashamed about, or it can be something that is you just accept as a part of yourself. You wake up every day, you have coffee, it makes you happy, it fulfills something for you. So is there a line that you draw, and where does that line fall? How do you define those two words in whatever you do?
I think there's a clear line, and it's a clinical line. I think part of what when we were prefacing kind of like some opening remarks, it's like not to like I think that I understand the question that's being asked and kind of like between the distinction, but I think that like in like your study, you're dealing with just a sample size that like cigarette addiction and something like being addicted to like maybe music or making music, because like one of them is a metaphor and another one's like a very physical, like a somatic reality. So but then again, it's also I think incremental, because like like I'm speaking for myself, I'm definitely absolutely addicted to coffee, like very much so. But the effects that has ultimately on my life are relatively benign. So it's something that I can like maintain as a bad habit, perhaps also an addiction, but that like don't necessarily sort of ruin things for me. But I mean, speaking about music, like you're going into a field where things like drug addiction and things like sexual addiction are like huge issues, and I think like learning how to I think it's like education versus kind of knowing who you are and what you're about is huge. But like, I mean, the question of artistic creation and drugs is another thing entirely that we don't have to go into.
Well, this is actually something I think about a lot, and not so much from the coffee side of things. I mean, like, I guess I actually was addicted to coffee for a long time, and I haven't. Well, I have the occasional cup of coffee, but like for the most part, I haven't had a cup of coffee in 2 months, and I work at a coffee shop. But aside from that, I think that I think this is a real question about, I mean, like neurons that fire together, wire together kind of thing. We have certain ways, certain modes of thinking that can become habits and that have rewards and punishments, either from the outside coming in or that we give ourselves. And those sort of form how we think of ourselves and what our social identity is within like the groups that we move, or as a student at Brown. And like one of the things that I think is very sort of socially reinforced at Brown, and because of like the structure of here we are at an academic university, and our task here is to be a student and to sort of produce material and to do your homework. And if you don't do your homework, you're not doing what you're here for. And I think that very much so, if you're not able to complete the tasks that you've set yourself, it very much feels as though sometimes you can have an identity crisis because of that. I was not able to complete this essay on time. I am a senior about to graduate. I'm not good at the thing that I do. And I think to a certain extent, that's a kind of addiction. And I think that's a hard thing because to a certain extent, like, yeah, what's the line between habit and addiction? Like, it's important to do your schoolwork. And once we graduate and we go out into the work world, it's important to get your work done. And it's important to play the part that you have set for yourself, your role. And so to what extent do we allow those things to shape our identity and to shape whether we feel happy or satisfied with who we are?
Kind of drawing it back to a public health perspective and kind of like both of our projects, I agree that I think like addiction is very much just a clinical term that's used. And I didn't specifically ask about addiction in my project, but comparing it to looking at people's sexual behaviors and sexual habits, I think that it brings up a good point in that a lot of people, encourage people to use condoms when they're engaging in sex and things along those lines. But how much are you actually going to be able to change people's habits? And kind of focusing more on discourse that emphasizes, okay, how can we reduce people's risk? How can we encourage people to go and get tested as opposed to just encouraging them to do this behavior? We can't like enforce a behavior on people. So what can we do that might be beneficial in the long term? So I would be interested also in hearing more about how participants in your study spoke about addiction, whether it was something they talked about more. Did they say it was an addiction? Was it something they talked about like their everyday habits, and how can you address that in the future if you have plans in the future to do so?
Yeah, so I conducted a qualitative focus group that had 9 participants who were currently homeless and smokers. And a lot of what came up there was smoking cigarettes is the most intense addiction that they have ever experienced. Quitting cigarettes to them is harder than quitting any other kind of drug that they're used to. But also trying to get to the reason behind smoking culture is so big in this population, and why is it so difficult to quit? There are a few things. So one of the main responses I got in what are the barriers that are inhibiting you from quitting smoking if you have that desire to want to quit. And one of the biggest ones was, I'm homeless. I don't have my own place. My life is not in my own control. They're living in shelters, transitional, temporary housing structures, and they have to fulfill all these criteria in order to be housed. So the way homelessness and housing first kind of works in Rhode Island is you have to fulfill this definition of chronically homeless. And that's when you have to have lived in a shelter for anywhere from like 30 to 90 days consecutively. So if one night your cousin or your sister offers you a place on their couch and you stay there for one night and you're back in the shelter the next night, you start back over at day one. And so it's very difficult to fulfill this definition of chronically homeless in order to be placed in housing. So one of the responses I got a lot was, smoking is one of the only things I have control over. It's an expression of autonomy. When you live in a transitional housing structure or temporary housing or in a shelter, your hours are not your own. The lights out at this certain time. You only get smoking breaks at a certain time. You eat at this time. You can only see your case manager at this time. And smoking is a way for a lot of these individuals to say, I know this is bad for me, but this is my choice. I have control over this. And another theme that came up a lot as far as what are barriers to quitting, or what are your perceived needs in order to quit, was this like support system. Rhode Island only has one smoking cessation program offered in the entire state that is in very small ways targeted towards underserved and underprivileged populations in the entire state. And we just moved from number 1 to number 2 in the rate of illicit drug use. So we're second to Massachusetts now. But most of these smokers who I interviewed
Sorry, that figures for illicit drug use in general?
illicit drug use, yeah.
Really?
Per capita. So based on size and population and what's the percentage of people who are using illicit drugs.
I feel like one comment that I just feel like I have to make is that, like obviously like the panel that we're talking about like is starting from like a base assumption, which is that like a lot of the habits or the addictions that I might form are not the results or are not being informed or affected by like my situation at home or like just my whether or not I'm homeless. So I think that like I would hesitate to kind of like make from my own perspective at least like to equate like caffeine addiction with like other types of drug addictions or stuff that like the whole benign versus malignant thing that I was talking about earlier. But at the same time, like I guess I would ask Ashley would be like, just in terms of just like observing and writing a thesis on sexual behavior, at least within the LGBTQ community, what exactly do you think the kind of role of education is outside of the classroom in terms of like making sure that the organizations on campus, like at the health center, that are like sort of, I know that there's like plenty of like programs that are in place to kind of like, could you like talk about that relationship a little more?
I think a common theme that came up specifically in the interviews that I conducted with students was that brown students generally are so educated about sexual health and so knowledgeable about sexual health, and like there are so many sexual health student groups on campus who do all of this great work, yet if I look at the results of my quantitative survey, how many students are actually practicing safe sex behaviors, which isn't as high as you would think it would be. And looking at students testing behaviors, like half of students have never been STI or HIV tested, and those that have been tested like once. So I think in terms of specifically education.
Or like even decentering the conversation, because I think a lot of times like, oh, well, the most important thing is like raising awareness, or the most important thing is educating, when a lot of times like that's the first step that like kind of allows, I think, an individual to kind of be complacent, or it doesn't necessarily translate into like the way that they'll behave about it.
Yeah.
So I'm saying like, what in addition to education are the measures that need to be taken to ensure that the Brown administration is as up to date as possible on things related to sexual health, or
given students generally are so aware about these topics, I think putting it more realistically, and like through the data that I collected, I'm meeting with health services, but I don't know how much promotion is actually done in terms of like demonstrating to students, look how many students aren't being tested for these things. Like, despite what students' perceptions are, there's such, people in the interview specifically cited like this invincibility, like the sense of invincibility among students at Brown, in the sense that like most students just don't perceive they're at risk for anything because like, oh, we're at Brown, like I'll be fine. So not necessarily educating students in terms of these are the diseases, these are how they're transmitted, but in terms of like putting it more realistically, specifically in the context of Brown, and also addressing other factors, which I'll get into a bit more later, that can also be related to people's sexual behaviors and also just generally sexual health knowledge. A lot of people spoke specifically about like mental health and how they felt that interacted with their sexual health. So I think focusing less on just knowledge specifically about like transmission and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a question for both Ash and Mo. So one of the things, just to tie it, I guess, back in sort of an interesting way to what we do at the underground, one of the things we think a lot about is like using the space as a way to have like a safe place for people to experiment with their habits. And so like setting up the like the space in such a way that it facilitates community building and facilitates people sitting next to people that they might not know, introducing themselves, maybe what could we do so that not everybody is like plugged into their headphones and their laptop and like all in their own little world. Like, is there a way that, you know, we could set up the tables or like create like a communal area or something? And I think what those sort of thoughts are predicated on is this idea of community and sort of like social groups as a way into changing people's habits, which I know is something that like is thought about a lot in sort of thinking about addiction. And there was that study that was done a couple of years ago with the rats, and the rats who had sort of a community of other rats were like less likely to become addicted to like drugs that were put in their food. And so that brings me to the question of like, yeah, what is the role of community in sort of like meeting people and sort of going past the level of just like institutional education and actually getting into like how do you actually change someone's habits, and then also just like how far can the institution penetrate, you know, and like it's one thing to just like educate people about something or have a panel or, you know, put out flyers or something, and it's another thing to actually like get into a culture and start to change a culture.
Yeah, so that's a great like question and way to kind of weave us all together. So the reason why I asked about all of these differences between each of us and our habits versus addictions is because we are all in different circumstances and we apply these habits to different forms. So I thought it was very important to see the distinction between the way the words habit and addiction play out in different situations. And that it is kind of the basis of why I did this entire mixed method study, individually interviewing currently homeless smokers, because I wanted to know what did they perceive as their needs and what were their perceived barriers, and how can I use this information to then ignite policy change and kind of change the administration and offer more services. And as I was saying, one of the biggest responses was they felt this lack of support. And I'm actually continuing this study for my master's thesis next year, and instead I'm going to be individually interviewing currently homeless people who have either never smoked before or have successfully quit smoking. And I'm looking at the idea of resilience. And so now I'm collecting information about the same topic from a different perspective, and then I'm going to combine all of this knowledge that I'm gaining. I'm going to add to the knowledge base in the literature, and I'm actually going to work with the Department of Health on how we can create support programs and cessation programs that are offered in a lot of different spaces and a lot of different forms that can actually now start providing resources and support and education to help create strategies for individuals to quit on their own time and fulfill their desire to want to quit, provide them with resources. So that's kind of a way that I've kind of connected all of our themes today, is how do we distinguish between, you know, what's a habit, what's an addiction, how do we take that information to change the administration, to ignite changes in policies, and how do we then relay that in education? How do we educate the masses on there are resources available, there are strategies available to you for you to accomplish these goals?
I think a big reason I took on the project I did was because it was specific to Brown, and because I was hoping that it would be able to implement changes and additional programming in the future. And I'm actually also staying next year, so I may or may not continue the project then. But I think I sort of lucked out in that I decided to do this project on my own, and I wanted to hear students' feedback on Brown Health Services as part of my project. I hadn't spoken to Brown Health Services ahead of time before I decided like that was something that was really important to me in this project. So I sort of planned out the entire thing and contacted them asking to speak to providers and see if they would be on board with the project. And they were, so I looked out there. And I think it's really great because they are so on board with the project, and like I've had meetings with them throughout the semester, and I have like a final meeting, well, probably not final, but a meeting to present just generally my overall results and try to discuss like things that could happen in the future. And I think part of the reason I wanted to ask specifically about Brown Health Services is because people will talk about like negative experiences they've had there, specifically among queer students at Brown, but it's always rumors, and in talking to providers also at health services, they knew that like these rumors go around, but have never really hear specifically about students' experiences, like concrete experiences, which was something I asked about in interviews, and things that could be changed in the future to better address students' concerns, and just generally, something I realized going about the interviews was that I feel like there isn't necessarily a great platform for students to like relay their experiences, and to like if a student has a negative experience, if health services doesn't know exactly what that experience was, then there's not really that much that can be done. And obviously students might not necessarily feel comfortable sharing their personal experiences, but if that communication just generally isn't there, then like there's not going to be a change in the future. And the director there is really on board with like getting students' feedback. So one of the major things that came up in my project, even though I was asking primarily about sexual health, was students' mental health concerns, and the fact that students might not necessarily feel comfortable going to CAPS, and like people have a lot of problems with CAPS. So students wish that at health services, if you're going for an appointment about basically anything, that some sort of like general question was asked just for a mental health check-in, and felt that students might feel more comfortable speaking in that type of environment. Obviously, providers at health services are meant to be a therapist, not like in that context, but just generally like some sort of check-in. And a few students specifically noted that they felt that check-in would be beneficial in terms of relating it to their sexual health. And then another major thing that came up talking about like creating spaces on campus was obviously we have the Lgbtq Center, which is great for certain people on campus, but there are also other individuals who don't necessarily feel comfortable in that environment for a variety of reasons. So another suggestion that was made was just like the importance of creating additional queer spaces on campus more generally, including making sure providers at health services are better educated, things along those lines, but also creating spaces within other centers at Brown was a major suggestion that was made, which some centers already have, but like having different types of support networks within different centers at Brown, whether it be BCSC, the First Gen Center, whatever. Just because particularly in racial ethnic minority respondents, looking at like intersectionality and the intersection of those identities, and not necessarily feeling supported in the current like queer groups that are present on campus. Yeah.
And institutional presence obviously is like not just having a space. It's about like kind of having your toes in like a lot of different communities and whatnot. So I think that like that sounds like a good thing going forward, which brings us to next section?
Yeah, so in terms of my next steps personally, obviously I haven't had this meeting with health services yet, so I don't know exactly what next steps will be, but I'm also planning to create a pamphlet to distribute to various centers and deans on campus. And I think it's really hard. I mean, we've spoken a lot about bureaucracy. It's really hard to make major changes, but based on like the results I got in my project, I think even like small changes, which would definitely be possible, could have such a big impact on campus and have such a long-standing impact.
Yeah, Katie and I we were having breakfast earlier and we were talking about like the question of bureaucracy again, and Katie made this point that like at the end of the day, and I think this is especially true about Brown, it's like the Brown bureaucracy is made out of people, and that there's like a system of accountability that is in place, which essentially has within it a core part of it is to slow things down so that like, I mean, it's like a protective measure, right? Like we can't just do this thing and then worry about it after. We have to make sure that like everything that we're doing, we know what we're doing, and we kind of know what we're gonna do in case something goes wrong. But what I was just gonna say was we were gonna talk about business habits, but I guess we just bridge on other comments on bureaucracy. Then, yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I think another thing that's like important to remember is we often tend to think of, you know, like the only way you can create institutional change is by working completely and totally within the institution and, you know, going top down and having, you know, new policies and stuff like that. But there's also a cultural side to all of those things. And the reason that you're doing that is, you know, to create a culture. And so a lot of times those things can happen at the same time. And you can, you know, be simultaneously working on the institutional things, like, you know, we're gonna get a new space, we're gonna create a new group. But at the same time, like, how do you actually like create the campus culture that surrounds a group like that? And once you do that, that has its own power and its own inertia. And, you know, it can go the other way too, like more like a grassroots movement.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think right now we end at 2:20, so we have a time for like a song, and then we'll do a Q&A, and then questions, yeah. So, so we're just gonna do, what do you guys want? What do you think works? Yeah, so would you rather hear the song first and then go to the Q&A, or like the other way? Q&A. Q&A first? Cool.
Do you want to have any questions?
Yeah.
Or comments?
We hope we could, like, because obviously the topics are so different, but I think yeah.
Actually, I really appreciate that point about not just inclusion of queer spaces, but more integration across different spaces. And so this is kind of a hard question, but I mean, from what I think, but the Great Research Center, how do you, there any ideas on how to make that more, I mean, given that we, you know, mostly advise on navigating the open curriculum, the academics at Brown, but you know, it's still very different for, you know, queer identified sexual university. So how do you think that we as a center could improve, you know, both with mental health, sexual health, and just supporting queer students in general? Anybody else, you know?
Okay.
I think in general, the CRC can kind of make itself more known to students, because that when I am struggling or when I'm looking for resources, that is never on my mind. It has never crossed my mind to just go up to the second floor and ask somebody. So I think in general, to start is to just kind of make the center more accessible to the entire student body as a whole, do more advertising and outreach to kind of say, hey, we're here. Because I think it's a center that not a lot of students know about in general.
Maybe partnering with more student groups, I think, is always a useful thing in that, just sort of like going back to the idea of top down versus bottom up. I think students often think about like institutions that feel very formal or official as something that they go to for only very formal or official issues, as opposed to, I think maybe like a really powerful move would be to sort of join with groups that are coming from the other direction, and have sort of like a culture around them, like groups that do social events, instead of like you guys trying to do your own social event, which you know sort of feels like more top down, sort of bridging that gap. you know, or like maybe partnering with like a social space on campus. Like the underground is kind of like a weird space like that, where in a certain sense an institution, but we're also made up of students. And I mean, I think in the future we're gonna try to do more events. So maybe like partnering with a social space and also like a student group, and you know, putting on like a series of movie nights or a series of concerts that are led by that specific student group, and that student group brings in the students that are like sort of in that social group that's, you know, surrounds that.
Also, I mean, a big part of what CRC does is like peers supporting peers through whatever their endeavors are. And something that had come up in reference to healthcare providers and CAPS providers, but I think is definitely applicable, is just having peers who identify similarly as you. And obviously not everyone will necessarily feel comfortable like discussing whether it's their sexual identity, with if you're someone who works at the CRC and has someone coming in, but among those who are and in situations where that might be applicable, I think it's really important that like the student coming in feels comfortable having that conversation, which would more likely occur if they feel they can like somehow identify with whoever staff is on.
Yeah. Any more questions, comments?
Did it feel like put together in the same group?
I think it was definitely a unique challenge because like they really are, like, at least compared to the other ones that I saw, they are like very different. But I think that like by using sort of concepts, which like even like you caught us even like talking a little bit about semantics, right? And like I think that the idea is that like the concepts we chose, education, they're like kind of broad enough as metaphors to allow for those angles that we all had. But definitely good experience. I'm happy I got to like meet other cool seniors doing awesome stuff. I wanted to talk about personal habits, but I know we're gonna get into the performance. But yeah, cool. Just because like we have 2 people who finished theses like this week, which is like awesome. Congratulations to both of them. But yeah, cool. And we should be. Yeah. Do you want to like stand? What do you want to do? Do you want to just play from the?
Should be able to do it.
I'm gonna go into the audience because I
Yeah,
want
I
to
want
be
to
a
watch
fan.
too.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Okay, so let's go figure out how I'm gonna do this. This is pretty. The mic's pretty loud, so it should be fine for me. Hello. Should be good. Actually, just put it up here.
I think maybe
That'll do.
good.
Yeah. Somebody killed us on our way. Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? 'Cause I'm in heaven. And it's so blue, it's so blue, it's so blue. I'm afraid I won't make it. I'm afraid I might fail. I'm afraid I won't break it. Afraid I won't make bail. I'm afraid they won't take it. I'm afraid I won't sell. I'm afraid I might lose somebody. I'm afraid I won't tell. Mama, why they don't call us? Why we never got no mail? Why they killing our people? Why they all look so pale?
Grandmama gon' leave us. Mama, please don't wail. And if there is no heaven, hope we never see no hell. I wish heaven had visiting hours. I would send my grandma flowers. There's no last call for alcohol. And I would live a life of champagne showers. And I would spend a couple hours in my grandpa, tell him I don't know where to start. And I would show him all of my scars. I'd tell him how we left Earth for Mars. Tell him we don't know who we are or where we going, but got 2 or 3 cars. And I would try to shower in the clouds, and I would try to rap for the stars. So if I never come back down, don't miss me, you might miss your pa. Tell him all of my dreams, and I tell him now my dreams ain't far. So every time I wake up, it's like take covers, they killing all of my brothers. Cause clear now they don't love us, we ain't kinfolk, we ain't lovers, we just black kids, we just others. So they kill 1, kill 2, and too many kill, they all above us. They look down on us and shine, sunshine in their eyes. But the white man, he look down on us, he hating all of their smiles, looking for bait, they know that we fly, trying to disguise it, all of their white lies. We don't matter, these black lies, so whenever we die, forever we all in the sky, yeah. Somebody killed us on our way. Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? 'Cause I'm in heaven. Yeah. And it's so blue, it's so blue, it's so blue. Somebody killed us on our way. Is it you? Is it you? Is it you?